Hi, I'm Alexandra Evreinoff, Managing Director for Involve. And today we're joined by Lin Yue, who is the Executive Director for Goldman Sachs Asset Management, and has been a huge advocate for D&I, growing up in China, and has actually featured as an empowered role model in these past couple of years. So Lin, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So today we want to speak with you, Lin, about basically talking about the anti-Asian sentiment and really what businesses can do about this. So we know that, unfortunately, racism against Asian communities has been prevalent. And it's important to highlight that the Stop Asian Hate campaign is directly related to the recent surge in anti-Asian sentiment and racism. Misinformation about COVID-19 from politicians and spokespeople around the world that refer to the virus as the Chinese virus has been fueling this rise in racism and hate crimes against Asian communities all around the world. What has been your experience as someone who experienced the first lockdown in mainland China and then came back to the UK?
Yes, so just to spend a little bit of time on my personal experience, because looking back, it has been quite the extraordinary journey. Because I went back to China for the Chinese New Year on the 23rd of January last year. The day that I landed was the day the lockdown in Wuhan started. So if you remember back in the UK, that's where people still thought it was a very isolated event that was happening in a very, very far place, and it was not relevant for them. But on the other hand, that was what China experienced as well, because there was no precedent of something like this has happened. Certainly, the lockdown of 11 million people in Wuhan on the New Year Day was nothing anyone has ever experienced before. And in a way, it was tougher because it was the Chinese New Year, the most important festival during the year that was cancelled on the day, effectively, with a very short notice. And 1.4 billion people's life were dramatically changed to a lockdown style. So at the time, no one else in the world can relate to that experience. So I think it was a very isolating experience from that point of view. But of course, I think within China, people really stay super connected via social media, from WeChat to TikTok. I mean, I wrote down some of the things I've observed last February, and then looking back at some of those things, it's just fascinating because the impacts were very visible in some of the industries. Because during the Chinese New Year period, that's a 7-day national holidays. That was 100% loss for more than 80% of the restaurants. The movie industry had zero income. The year before, they sold 13 billion pounds during the same 7-day period. And there were 400 million domestic visits that were cancelled because that was the number was recorded last year. And the small and medium-sized business were impacted most. But at the same time, there were some early stage optimism because in January and February, there were 300 million employees worked remotely across 18 million companies. They were the first to joke that 90% of meetings were not necessary, 10% of remaining meetings can be held online, and most of the work can be done from home, something we all came to realize later on. And the apps for kind of purchasing supermarket deliveries that have enjoyed a tremendous 300% growth. The internet medicine has grown significantly. The online meeting app has gone up, 15% in terms of demand. And then the online education became the new norm. So that was really what happened during the lockdown last February. And then if you look at what has happened later on in the UK, it was almost the exact same pattern, even on the psychological side, from the initial disbelief, shock, distrust, and sadness to calm, humor, and then somewhat optimism. And there was a similar recognition of the healthcare workers. It can be a unifying experience where a nation faces similar challenges and share these emotional journeys together. So I finally managed to get back to the UK towards the end of May. So a 2 weeks holiday turned to a 4 month long time in China. But that was also after 4 flights cancellations. You know, I bought this most expensive one-way ticket I've ever purchased. It was 10 times of the usual price. But when I got on the plane, I understood why, because there were only 10 people on this plane. I was just grateful that there were even running flights on that basis. And then a bit of a contrast I remember vividly is when I left the immigration desk in China, they asked me repeatedly, are you sure you want to go back to the UK? Because back then, you know, China has already got the virus contained, where UK, you know, was a much worse situation. But contrast that to when I landed in Heathrow in last May. At the time, there was no extra check, and then I just went straight through. So it was just a very big contrast at the time. But I think to your point earlier, I think maybe last May, when the virus started to be contained within China, but it got much worse in the West, that's where the sentiments towards China have really kind of deteriorated. And from a Chinese professional perspective, there has been an in-depth survey conducted by 2 authors from the Harvard Business Review. So they looked at 250 Asian employees across North America, and many of these firms they work for have a very strong focus on diversity. And what they found is, rather unfortunately, that despite the diversity focus of these firms, half of the people reported they have been mistreated at work due to the prejudice associated with the virus. And specifically, they found, you know, while the policies focusing on equitable employment had a beneficial impact for all Asian employees, it harmed professionals of Chinese descent. So in certain cases, encouraging Chinese professionals to advertise their cultural heritage at work could easily backfire and turning these employees into targets for mistreatments. I guess the bigger picture here is, you know, when people are scared and uncertain, they'll often look for someone to blame. And during the pandemics, that role of the scapegoat has often fallen onto the Chinese people. And it was very unfortunate that I actually had a first-hand experience of this in the UK, that one Saturday afternoon last November, when I walked into the shopping center with my family, as I walked into the gate, there was this guy who sat next to the gate, made eye contact with me, looked in disgust, and threw his full hot coffee at me. So, you know, when I mentioned, you know, this to people here, they found it very shocking. But it was actually not shocking amongst the Chinese communities, because it was quite a common experience amongst us. So experiencing harassment can be highly harmful to anyone's mental health. But even for those who have not been personally mistreated, you know, being exposed to these events among their peers and in the media is very psychologically draining. And unfortunately, I think that just formed a part of our experience, in addition to that the stress of being in the lockdown effectively.
Yeah, I can imagine. That sounds like a horrifying experience, really. And it's really, really sad to see how people have reacted around the world and still react in a way and try to put the blame on someone or a whole community, actually. Hopefully these people will reach a point where they will be able to perhaps gain greater perspective on how you know, the world has evolved in the past year and a half, let's say. So thank you, Lin. So in terms of actually talking about the Asian community, well, when we say the Asian community, it's very vast and encompasses many different identities. What would you say are 2 misconceptions about Asian communities that we can use the space to kind of like debunk?
It's a great question. And then let me start with just China, you know, where I came from, and then we'll come to the Asian part briefly as well. On the China thing, I think compared with the kind of cultural diversity amongst different regions in China, on the race dimension, it's quite a homogeneous society. So that's a country that has very few immigrants, even in today's major cities like Beijing or Shanghai. That's less than 1%, in contrast, you know, with London, for example. So this really contributes to China's understanding of the world it's a lens that is not through the multicultural, multi-ethnicity lens that the West often experienced it. But by contrast, within the overseas Chinese groups, the people you're likely to interact with, I'm not sure if you're aware, but there are quite a few subgroups that are very distinct. So you have the British-born Chinese, the parents are typically from Hong Kong, and their identity can be British. And you have Hong Kong Chinese, and their experience is linked with being part of the UK colony. Then you have Taiwan, that is relatively new democracy. You have Singapore, and to a less extent, Malaysia. That is really a multicultural society with a Chinese majority. And then you have mainland Chinese like myself. We're the new joiners to the world. And not so long ago, that was the communism. So, while we look the same, the environment that we grew up in couldn't be more different. So I think that is a big kind of perception people have, that if we look the same, that we are the same. But now, if you add the Asian community, right, so there are at least more than 20 different cultures and religions originating from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. And in terms of the background, and consists of refugees, immigrants, and then individuals who are first generations. So this is the group that has the largest income disparity, the greatest wealth distribution and educational attainment. So when it comes to even the Asian professionals, and specifically their progression for success, there is also a huge divide as well, because we have this term called the bamboo ceiling, which speaks to Asians as a group having the lowest chance of rising to management positions. But while the bamboo ceiling is typically linked with Asians, the recent study from the US National Science Academy has revealed that there is a divide between South Asians and East Asians when it comes to this bamboo ceiling. The East Asians are much more likely than South Asians to attain leadership positions. And then the South Asians can a lot of the times outperform the white professionals. So this bamboo ceiling, is more for East Asians as opposed for the whole Asian group. So I would say, to your point, this label Asian obviously fails to capture the richness of individual cultures, geographies, and challenge for this group.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's actually really interesting, Lin, when we look at as well as how we talk about race and ethnicity, for example, in the workplace. And it's interesting when we have these conversations with people in the UK, in the US, in Europe,
yes,
and absolutely in Asia. The language is incredibly different. And of course, ethnicity and race are not interpreted or don't necessarily mean the same thing in different countries, even when you look at the wide region, but then even in different countries, they mean different things as well. So it's very, very interesting to look at this with a global perspective as well. Thank you. Thanks, Lin. And in terms of yourself as an Asian woman, a Chinese woman, and a senior business professional, have you ever experienced barriers to progression in your career?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this division between the South Asians and the East Asians. And according to some of the research from Ascent Foundation, the culture factor for Asians is 3 times greater than the gender effect as a glass ceiling factor. So if you think of being a woman is bad enough, being a East Asian woman is 3 times worse of that. Yeah. So it's almost like we are most likely to be hired because of the educational attainment, but we're least likely to be promoted to executives. And then I think the Asian women indeed were the least likely to become executives because of this double whammy that we face. And then that is a huge contrast with not only the educational attainment, but also this career ambition from this group. And I believe, there are a few kind of internal and external reasons for this. Because internally, I think there are probably 3 things that have the most negative impact on our career. 1 is the belief in keeping heads down. 2 is the cultural deference to authority, the respect. And then 3 is this ineffective communications and influencing skills. And externally, I think there is an implicit perception or even expectation that most Asians, by demonstrating technical excellence, prefer technical roles. So we're expected to be good workers, but we're not expected to be good leaders. And I mentioned the division between the South Asians and East Asians when it comes to bamboo ceiling. And indeed, I think that's what the analysis have revealed, that one of the biggest gaps between these two groups is the East Asians score low in assertiveness. That plays a big role in obtaining leadership positions, and they're not communicating in a way that's expected in large corporates. And then you asked my personal experience. Maybe I think it's best to just share with you an example, because when I first stepped into the Western corporates, and especially, I work for an American company, that I learned that there is this general belief that is called the squeaky wheels get degrees. I guess in our cultures, we believe in a direct opposite. That is, the loudest dog gets shot. So, and I remember experiencing this firsthand because when I was about 6 months into the job, I was called into the room by a manager, and he said, Lin, I've noticed something. You seem to have some really good ideas one-on-one. How come you never speak up in team meetings? I was genuinely shocked by this question, because to me, it was very natural to pay respect to more senior members of the team. But he said, oh, it doesn't work like that. You need to speak up. So I did. I think the first times I remember my heart was pounding so badly, because it went against everything that I have believed in. I was that dark that felt like it was about to get shot. But nevertheless, I persisted. And then about 6 months later, I was called into the same room by the same manager, who said, Lin, I've noticed something. You spoke up and you showed me absolutely no respect. And that was great. I mean, I'm not suggesting anyone to disrespect their manager. That can be a dangerous career strategy. But I think it highlights something that is quite fundamental in terms of the Asian professionals' experience, and then the diversity topic. Because I think the experience of what I'm going through and what I'm perceived by my colleagues, they are almost in parallel universe. Because when I didn't speak in meetings, these are the three things that are happening. I'm waiting for my cue to speak because we were told it was rude to talk over each other. I'm paying my respect because we don't want to be the loudest dog. And then the third one is I don't want to give half-baked comments because we were told to only speak up when answers were perfect. It took me a long time to understand that was how it was perceived by others when I don't speak. They also have three thoughts when I don't. One, I don't have views. Two, I'm not confident. Or three, I have poor communication skills. And these are pretty damaging perceptions for people in our organizations. But no one has decoded this for me other than simply asking me to speak up. And I had several crises because of it. So I think, I am kind of having this awareness and develop further into this thinking. And then really, I think it's important to address this on the three levels, from the individual level to the team level to the organizational level. And then I guess, if I can just share a little bit on this, on the first personal level, I think it really helps me with the awareness in terms of when I wasn't speaking up in meetings. Now I realize why, because I was told by my culture to behave this way, but my culture is not me. At least that's not me entirely. So I now have a choice. And this is quite important because I used to think there's something wrong with me. And people who give me the feedback ask me to fix it without understanding where I come from either. And then I take it very personally. So this decoding of what influenced our behavior was really very, very liberating. But also, I'm also aware of when I don't speak up, how is that being perceived? So without having to conform to change who I am, I think now I'm kind of changing styles, modifying a set of behaviors depending on the situation. So so that has really been something I have benefited from a personal, individual level. But I think at the team level, though, it doesn't just stop with my own action. I'm sharing this experience with my colleagues, with my team, hopefully to bridge some gaps in perception. I think it's quite simple because if we don't share, how would they know? And then I think it's a responsibility to contribute to the diversity science and then share those perspectives to redirect their perceptions on how they should see us. And then at the same time, being open is taking a huge risk to be very vulnerable here. And I'm hoping that can also cultivate this sense of psychological safety as a leader of our business. And I guess lastly, at the organization and the industry level, it doesn't stop with us. And then I'm trying to drive some of the bigger changes to raise the awareness of some of the things that we have spoken about. So this is just my current framework. It's a very involving space, but I really hope that there are more and more people on board to make organizations more inclusive.
Absolutely, and there are thankfully through our role model lists, we do see more and more applications come in of people actually driving inclusion and equity in business, which is incredibly inspiring. What would you say are some ways that you would like to see businesses lead the way in creating workplaces that are inclusive of Asian communities?
I want to touch on two key things here. Firstly is just as the term Asian doesn't really capture the different dimensions of the underlying people, I think the term diversity can also be simplifying a range of activities to focus on, from recruiting to promotion to advocacy. So I think it's important for organizations to realize diversity is only the first step. That means it's for everyone to have a seat at the table. And then the inclusion is the next step, which is to make sure that everyone has a voice. And there is a third step, that is the belonging, that is for the voice to be heard. And I think, there is a lot of research showing that having a sense of belonging is the best indicator of a healthy work environment. So that means in a moment like this, organizations really need to acknowledge the excess stress that many Asian employees are under and provide them with the appropriate support and resources. So, for example, the flexibility from manager on non-pressing working deadlines, the culturally relevant mental health support, which I think is actually highly lacking at this stage, and the basic best practice for reducing anxiety, such as communicating with more transparency and inviting them to kind of share their experiences. But related to this, and then my second point I think is really important, and I will spend a little bit of time on this, just bear with me, is I think it's really important we recognize we don't want to put all the responsibilities on driving this change on those individuals who are minorities. And there's some very fascinating research from Harvard Business Review on how organizations are set up in the first place. If we think about this, when today's organizations were set up, it was by and large to support an ideal type of workers to succeed, like a prototype, if you like. And then research has shown that even across geographies, across cultures, that this is by and large a man. And we think of a manager, so we think of somebody that is male, but it's not just male, right? Socioeconomically, it is a middle-class male. And then this is a straight male as well. And if you think about the style component, this is someone who's willing to engage in a sort of dominant, assertive, aggressive, or competitive behaviors to get ahead. And then these are the people who are much more likely to make work their number one priority. And related to this is someone who's also free from dependent care responsibilities like children or elderly parents. So this is what our organizations are set up for. It wasn't with everyone in mind. So if you fit almost by default, you walk in, it is easier for you to access networks, be sponsored, to see you as a leader, simply because you fit with that prototype when it comes to leadership. But the reverse is also true. The more ways that you differ from this ideal standard, the more challenges you're going to experience trying to advance at work. And I think it certainly explains why women who want to have babies is so incompatible with the current setup, because the current organizations, they weren't set up with considering these factors to begin with. So as a nation and as a woman, I think it's very easy for us to internalize everything, right? So when you don't feel like you fit in, you think, as I mentioned, something is wrong with us. And then it's all on us to conform so much. So, and then to give an example of this, not speaking up in meetings and how difficult it is to break through this cultural belief. I think there were some studies about the Korean pilots in the 80s, because there were a lot of plane crashes. It was well documented. So they were trying to figure out why that was. And then only until they start to listen to the conversations in the cockpit, they start to understand why. Because when there were problems, the co-pilot was so afraid to speak up to the captain that they, despite spotting something wrong, they kept quiet. You think, why would anyone rather kill themselves than just speaking up? But literally, that kind of respect for hierarchy cost their lives. This is how hard it is for people with that kind of a cultural belief to go against what they were brought up and then to fit in. And then the other thing I often heard is other minorities that I've met, they also say this. They said, because we're the minority, we have to try twice as hard. This is where growing up in China provides me a different perspective, because I was in the majority back then. So I wasn't growing up as a minority. And I was like, I refused to accept we have to try twice as hard, because we're already trying so hard to adapt ourselves for this huge cultural differences. We're already initiating the changes in organizations that are not designed for us in the first place. And now we have to try twice as hard in addition to this huge task just to be accepted at work. So this is what I think, organizations, the established majority, really need to do a lot more. Stop thinking it's more like an optional act, but really just rely on the minorities to drive all the changes. So I guess all in all, what I'm saying is that both for individuals and for organizations, it's not enough just to lean in. We have to really change the system.
Yeah, absolutely. There are systemic barriers, and their systemic risk, discrimination actually does exist in business and in general, let's say in governance bodies and government bodies as well. So public organizations, etc. So this is incredibly interesting, Lin, and we could talk for hours about this. Definitely a topic that I could just keep going on and on. But I do know you also have lots of other priorities. So in terms of the next question, what would be your advice to allies who aren't really sure on how to best advocate for Asian communities?
I think first, this is probably the recognition that there has been an insufficient understanding of Asians' professionals' experience. I mean, there are some very big picture reasons for this. For example, right, so we're the first generation of mainland Chinese that work in Western corporates. So there is very little intelligence from existing role models that can help us navigate the rule book of the Western corporates. So, and equally, that also means the companies, they don't have this intelligence that's culturally appropriate to help us. So it's very much an evolving place that we are figuring out this emerging identity of ourselves. But I guess there is also this lack of understanding between China and the West, and then it was intensified during this COVID-19 situation. But that can translate into microaggressions for Chinese professionals. So for example, if we say something about China, often it's just to offer a different perspective, a different experience, but that would contrast what you heard from the media, the kind of slightly out of date image, then people will assume that we have some government links and are speaking on behalf of them. That is just simply not true. And then it puts a lot of psychological stress on us to kind of wanted to share and wanted to speak up. So I think the first step is understanding and awareness, because once you know people's experience, naturally you wouldn't want to say those things to them. So instead of thinking the microaggressions are lists of things that you shouldn't say, understanding the reasons will help you not say them anyway. The second point in relation to that is we can all start doing a bit more by micro actions. This is the opposite of microaggressions. You know, that's the things that you can do to cultivate this sense of belonging and psychological safety, such as, you know, use a colleague's name in conversation, and then once a month, maybe, you know, go out for coffee or lunch that you don't know well, have an opportunity to learn where they are from and then what they do. I think I read this example from BlackRock. They have this exercise that when they have the experienced new hires, they ask them to share their favorite food as growing up as one of the kind of icebreaker questions. That really opened up the conversation, which consists of different culture and upbringing. I thought that was a really good idea. So for allies, for Asian employees specifically, I think it's really important to challenge the thinking given the understanding of the cultural differences we mentioned. Because, you know, for example, this experience in meetings. So perhaps next time when you see an Asian colleague not speaking up in meetings, instead of thinking they might not have views, pause a second and think perhaps they were just waiting for their turns or showing their respect, or they need a little bit of encouraging because they were told to only speak up when answers are perfect. So reach out to them first before the meeting to ask them about their views and make sure you call upon them to share their views. And then, you know, if they cut off mid-sentence, make a point to jump in and ask them to continue. So all of those kind of micro actions can really make a huge difference to the Asian employees. And the last point that I wanted just to touch on is this kind of lean towards the commonalities we have. Because really this year, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the similar experience during COVID at the personal level is just extraordinary, right? We were all anxious, we were all afraid, but we also supported each other and cheered a night for health workers. It's a time of both tragedy and also optimism. So I think the common ground can be leveraged into something that is not only empowering individuals, but with a much bigger and enduring impact. I think you and I spoke about this before, right? So there are 450 million Chinese millennials, for example. That's a number that's more than the US and European millennials combined. They are much more similar to the Western millennials than the previous generation. You know, it goes beyond gender, race, faith. We're all tech-savvy, value-add, environmentally conscious, and do not face the constraints from previous generations. So combined with this economic rise of many of the Asian countries, there is a huge desire for them to be part of this world. So as an ally, I think it's really exciting to tap into this, uncover the similarities, and we can join forces together to stop Asian hate, to make Me Too count, to make Black Lives Matter. We have very exciting times ahead of us as there's a global cohort of people.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more with you, Lin. And it's incredibly encouraging to see a lot of business leaders being a lot more human in this past year with all the events that we've gone through. So let's, I hope, finish on a hopeful note and really keeping our fingers crossed so that things will evolve in that way, and that will continue to be more and more human and actually humanizing businesses, and especially in this global world where we're all interconnected and should be there to support each other as well. So thank you so much, Lin, for your time, and it was a real pleasure chatting with you today. So yeah, hopefully we'll connect again very soon.
Sounds good.
All right, take care, Lin.
Take care.